Running Light Ministry podcast is brought to you by listeners like you. You can support these podcasts by making a gift to the ministries at runninglight.org.
The replacement rate right now, I think, is at less than 1%. Like we're hovering around 1% right now in America.
And he basically said, like, it's so weird that, like, as a country we could be, and the Western world as a whole is hovering around 1%. He's like, it's so weird that we could, like, our whole civilization is basically about to crumble. Like, it literally is crumbling, and people just can't care less. And they're more focused on abortion. They're like, we need to get less kids born. As few kids born as possible is great. And no one really cares. Like, that is a really good point.
And that's where the society is.
That's right.
And that's where we're at.
We're literally dying out, and we're like, we need to have less kids.
It's like, that's right.
Let's kill the kids that are being born, that are about to be born.
That's right. I know, we're so wacky, huh?
We're awesome.
Well, it takes years of great overpopulation education to get it in everybody's brain, automatically that, what, we are way overpopulated. It's like so overpopulated, we can do abortion and we're good to go.
Yeah.
It's actually good for us. It's interesting. Anyway, welcome to the podcast. This is Running Light Ministries, and it's going to be podcast. I don't know which one just yet, but it's
100 and something.
100 and something. We're in the 100 and something ones. And we are going to be discussing, Peter and I. My name's Beau, and I'm with Peter. And we have been in Running Light for a long period of time. And these podcasts are available to you on SoundCloud or iTunes. Just go to Running Light Ministries and you can check it out. But we've been doing this for a long time. We talk about the Bible, love and lust and life and stuff like that, sex culture, marriage, divorce, sex, penises, vaginas, you name it. We talk about it.
The gamut, yeah.
We don't mess around here. So if you struggle with these terms and you're not used to these terms, then we would always encourage you to read your Bible. Right?
Yeah.
Read your Bible. You'll get there. Yeah, absolutely. So the Bible is a wonderful book, and the whole book's an actually allegory. All 66 books are allegories to God's relationship with his people, which is pretty interesting. And it's very much a relationship. So relationships are vital, and more vital than we think, obviously, in our day and age. Or that we propose that they are. So anyway, we got a really cool article. We want to break this article down to you because it's super phenomenal.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting. So this is an article written in June 24th, so a couple weeks ago, by a guy named Aaron Snodgrass, which is a sweet name.
Good name.
And it's called Swearing Off Men and Avoiding Intimacy. Generation Z reconsiders sex in the wake of a post-Roe world. So this article came out just, I think, a couple days after Roe versus Wade was overturned by the Supreme Court. So Supreme Court overturned it on June 15th. So just like 9 days after this article was written. So what they did, this is from, I can't remember what site I pulled this off of, but essentially they went around and started interviewing members of Generation Z. And those of you guys who don't know, Generation Z are people who were born after 1996. And usually the cutoff is around 2007, 2008. So most generations, like when they use these terms like Gen X, which is what Beau is from, or Millennial, which is what I'm from, or Gen Z, usually it's about a 10-year window, right? So to be a Millennial, you're born anywhere between usually it's around 86 to 95. Usually that's the cutoff. Gen X is around 74, 75, other way up to 85. And then you got the boomers before you, and then you have the traditionalists before that.
And what I find interesting before we launch in is that every generation has its interesting cultures and subcultures.
Yep.
Every single one.
Yep.
we all do it for similar feelings and desires and needs and whatever. But we all get involved in some kind of culture, teen culture of some sort. And I say that just because sometimes people think that what we're seeing today in young people culture, which I find funny and confusing myself.
Yeah.
But I just lived enough life nowadays where I look at it and kind of go, oh, that's funny. But young people today, they have their things that they go to, and they have peer pressures and they have everything that we had too. And for my generation, whether it was a lot of it had to do with our music, that's how we rebelled, was through music, having sex with whoever we wanted, getting maybe piercings done. That was really big in my generation.
Yeah. And I think what people have pointed out that's interesting about Gen Z is that in your generation, when you did that, it was actually rebellion,
Right.
meaning that like the power hierarchy, the structure of power was actually offended by that kind of behavior. This generation's very interesting, in which the power hierarchy are the ones that are championing this behavior, and actually the dissidents, right, the counterculture, are actually people who aren't into that kind of thing, right? So.
Right. The pure, back in my day, it would have been, straight edge punk.
Right.
The straight edge punk scene that was like the sober punk movement.
Yeah.
Of my day. That would have been the rebellious. That would be the rebellious movement today.
That's right. If you're sober and you plan on waiting till marriage, dude, you are crazy.
You are nuts.
You are counterculture
Totally.
to the max,
It's so true.
The funny thing is though is that people in Generation Z think that they're rebelling.
Right.
That's the crazy thing. Or once again, like your generation could actually say you were rebelling because you had Reagan in office, the conservative movement was actually growing and gaining a lot of steam. Conservative values were very high up on people's priority list. It was right after the Vietnam era. People were going back to nationalism and patriotism.
Yeah, and we saw a bunch of big corporations coming on the
Right.
scene. We
Right.
kind of saw big government corporate collusion back then.
Yeah.
We saw giant companies starting to come on the scene. Microsoft, IBM. This corporation world.
And they were all looking at you kids and saying, "Get a haircut."
Yeah, and we were
and get a job.
And we were riding our skateboards, flipping people off. Didn't even care about street lights or traffic signals.
And now the people with long hair and nose
right.
rings,
They're
they
in
are the
office.
ones running the country. Yeah, they're the ones who are like the Jack Dorseys running Twitter. Those are the guys who are actually running the world. So it is funny that they think that they're rebelling, but they're actually doing exactly what the people in power want them to be doing.
And maybe what happened is our generation grew up and we became leaders.
Yep.
And we just never changed.
Yeah, exactly. Dude.
And they're just like, hey, you know what? Let's make the rebellious the right.
Right.
And let's make the, what we remembered as being the wrong, that conservative feel.
Right.
We considered that the wrong growing up, but now that we're all grown up, maybe we're like, let's make that the wrong.
Right. Which again, it's like crazy because, they called it the sexual revolution because the majority of people had kind of Judeo-Christian sexual ethics that were like, wait till marriage, build a family, that kind of thing. I can't tell you the last premarital counseling I've had where the couple actually was absent until marriage. Like honestly, that's in the church, these are people wanting to be married. I literally cannot remember the last couple that I counseled for premarital that literally were waiting until marriage. Can you?
You.
Yeah, yeah, that was 7 years ago.
Yeah, that was probably it.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's a very rare, right?
Yeah, incredibly rare
Small
nowadays.
percent, maybe 5%.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's in the church. I don't
Yeah.
know. Outside the church, it's like zero, But,
That's right.
but yeah, no. And so talking to these Gen Zers of like how they're reacting to the overturning of Roe versus Wade, it was really eye-opening for me when I read it. Honestly, like I think it is a good article to read because it really does open your eyes to how this younger generation views sexuality, how they view ethics, and how they view abortion, which is very different than I think any other generation views it. So let's just read some of it because, again, it will probably sound shocking to some people, but again, very illuminating. So this is from a 24-year-old. Her name is Madeline. And this is Insider, right? That's right. Insider did, not Business Insider, but Insider magazine. So Madeline, who asked that Insider use only her first name, has decided that sticking to female partners may be the safest sexual route these days. It's not a fear of men exactly. So that's an interesting phrase in and of itself. It's not a fear of men exactly that has inspired this young woman to consider swearing off an entire gender. It's the heightened fear of an unwanted pregnancy and a subsequent lack of options that has forced Madeline to proceed with sexual caution in the wake of Friday's Supreme Court decision, gutting federal abortion rights protections. Man, so what are your thoughts on that?
I think it's pretty predictable in this way, but I find it fascinating in just getting kind of into some young person's brain and seeing how they work, and they go, man, I don't have a fear of man. It's not like I have a fear of a penis.
Yeah, exactly. That's what she says. Not a fear of men. Exactly. So it's not even like a flat out denunciation that there's a fear of the patriarchy of men. It's just, well, not exactly.
Not exactly a fear of men. But she thinks like, hey, I'll just stick to some women right now, just hang out with them, have some sex with them, and I'll be good to go. So it's kind of a reevaluating of her sexual partners.
And this is something that can only really happen in the West. And I've told people this. So I've had numerous parents come to me in the last couple months telling me that their kids are bi, they're trans, they're this, they're that, these kind of things. And I said, like if you go around the world, right? So I've been to Afghanistan, right? I've studied a lot of literature from more ancient parts of the world. What you realize is that people's view of sex is that sex is malleable, right? That's been the traditional view of humanity for as long back as we can remember it. Meaning that, like, when I went to Afghanistan, they're against gay people per se, but pretty much everyone has sex with little boys, right? That's just a part of their culture. And it's not considered gay to do that. If you read about the ancient Greeks or the Romans, I was just reading about the Symposium that Plato wrote. And the Symposium is basically just a drunken party where a bunch of dudes are hanging out and talking about other dudes and wanting to have sex with them. And it's this really raucous kind of homosexual elite party that's going on. And that was totally normal. Like that was just common in that time. So in that culture, the idea wasn't you're born this way, right? You're just born with an innate attraction to men. In that culture, it was just like, yeah, I have sex with men and I have sex with women. Like it wasn't considered like anything inherent to a person's personality. They did view it as something you would choose to do. Like, I enjoy being with men and I enjoy being with women. And it wasn't really a big deal. It really only comes from a culture that is going to say our sexual ethics are going to be based on Leviticus 19, and we're not going to have sex with little boys, right? We're not going to have sex with young kids. We're not going to have sex with people of the same gender. We're only going to marry one person and be sexually exclusive with that one person. That was a radical thought when that came into vogue. And I think a lot of people growing up in the West don't realize what a radical thought that was.
Yeah.
But in a culture like that, we get this idea of inherited sexual preference, that people are just born with inherited sexual preference and it can't change. It's not malleable. But what this new generation, I think, is showing us again is, yes, it is, right? It is malleable. You can, right? You can just say, you know what? I'm going to go to women now. Or, you know what? I'm going to go to men now.
Yeah, absolutely. And what's weird is I think, like, people that grow up in church culture, they read the Bible a lot, or maybe they don't read the Bible a lot, but they go to church a lot. So they're part of kind of this Judeo-Christian vibe.
Right.
And they take a lot of things for granted that you're talking about. Taking for granted that, we're going to be monogamous heterosexual people.
Right.
Where when I grew up, I didn't grow up in even Generation X Southern Cal life. I didn't, so I pretty much knew that humans could have sex with whoever they wanted, whenever they wanted, however they wanted.
Right.
And that it really was that you didn't have this like you didn't think like you were going to do anything long term, like nothing was going to be long term, but it was just a pleasure principle.
Right.
It was like, hey, this is what fulfills me at this time, this is how I'm going to go. So I was kind of pleasantly surprised coming into the church, going, hey, maybe there is something to resisting, all the senses, the sexual senses.
Right.
Maybe there's something to that.
That perhaps I have sexual desires that ought to be resisted.
Yeah, maybe they should be resisted, and maybe I shouldn't just think like, oh, let's just try to like fulfill sexual pleasure any old way we want to do that.
Right.
And I think overall though, many people today, especially Gen Zs, haven't been educated of history and sexuality in history. So they tend to think like LGBTQ whatever is new.
Yeah, it's like totally new.
It's like a new
Never
phenomenon.
happened.
Yeah, and they're like, wow, we have rights and da 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 da, and like, no. Like humans have always been doing this stuff.
Right.
And there's certain cultures that would kill you for all kinds of different things, different practices. It depends on who's in authority, what authority is ruling the sexual world,
right,
so to speak.
And I think that leads to another interesting point that a lot of people don't understand, and that is, I was talking to someone about this earlier this week, where he said, well, ethics shift depending on what culture you're in.
Mm-hmm.
And it was kind of his argument against the idea that there is an objective moral structure. I said, well, yeah, ethics do change depending on what culture you're in, just like facts change depending on what culture you're in. Meaning that, like, some cultures don't believe, if you go back in time, they don't believe what we think right now about the universe and about the galaxies and about the stars and the planets. And, they don't believe the way that we do. But does that mean because there's malleability amongst cultures, does that mean there is no objective truth? Right? And he had to think about that for a second, but eventually came to the conclusion of like, well, no, there are things that are objectively true.
Yeah,
and
no matter what.
No matter what.
Even if you don't have all the knowledge yet.
That's right. And so moral truths are like that, where it's like, yeah, there are cultures who thought in all these different ways, but just because there's different moral ethics when it comes to sex and things like that, that doesn't mean there isn't an objectively right thing to do with your sexuality. Yeah. It just means that different civilizations have come to different conclusions.
Yeah.
And most of them have been pretty prolific about their sexuality. Most of them have not been very restrictive about what you can do sexually. Yeah. The basic rule of thumb that you see throughout the ages is that they did have a concept of recreational sex, but they also did have a concept of procreational sex. So there was this idea of like, as a man, this is why arranged marriages were so big in the ancient world. As a man or a woman, you have a responsibility to your tribe, to your city, to your state, to your family, to have offspring. But it doesn't mean that every time you're having sex is for the purpose of having offspring.
Yeah, you're thinking of the collective.
That's right. So it's like in Afghanistan, no joke, this is one of their sayings. They said, women are for kids, men are for pleasure, right? Because what they recognize is that if you're having sex with a guy, there's no utility to that. There's nothing... You're not going to be able to produce life with that sexual activity.
Yeah, it only goes so far.
So it's purely recreational.
Yeah, and that's what and that's what we see with this lady, right? This young girl. It's just that idea of like, hey, sex isn't really about the collective. It's not about the big picture per se.
Right.
It's just about, hey, me having some fun.
Yeah.
And I like to have some fun with maybe some guys, but hey, you know what? It's not going to happen.
I don't want to get pregnant.
Roe Vs Wade got, I live in a state that's going to not allow me to get an abortion. So, you know what? I'll just, go hang out with my girlfriends and we'll have some fun. That kind of thing. And I think, certainly we're going to see that more and more where, young women, there's many things against young women in the world. It's probably one of the most tragic topics today is the abuse in young girls worldwide. And I'm not talking just about beating down girls. I'm talking about the way the systems are set up. But, I think we're going to see massive shifts in people going towards same-sex, behavior. I already think we see that. And I don't think the church has done many good things with so much negative talk about sex for so long. I think it's pushed many young people into lesbianism or the gay life because there is a feeling of inadequacy. There's a scaredness to it all, and there's a lot of negativity around the topic. There's a lot of taboo around the topic of sex within the church, and that certainly pushes a lot of people in different directions.
Absolutely. I think, for someone who, number one, might have sexual urges and desires that are not really talked about within a Christian context and worldview, that might make them think that, like, hey, maybe I don't belong in this culture because I have these desires that no one really talks about and no one really mentions as being present in them. So maybe there's something fundamentally different about me.
Yeah.
But also, in the church, we don't really have the language, right? Most churches don't speak in a way where we're talking about fighting sexual urges. We speak in such a way where it's like the sexual urges are just not present.
Right. Stop.
Right.
It's like the end.
Yeah, that's right. So like when you hear most pastors talk about their sexual urges, you don't ever hear about them talking about aberrant sexual urges, right? You don't really hear pastors being like, you know what, man, I'm married, but I sometimes desire to be with other women, or I sometimes desire to view pornography or to go like that would be the honest truth, that we have sexual desires that are not good, that are immoral, and we have to fight them. And so the idea you can get inside of a church is if you have a sexual desire that's aberrant, that's not correct, you could think, oh my gosh, like maybe this is who I am. This is just the summation of what my sexuality is. This defines me, and then it moves them in a very different direction.
Yeah, and another point too. Maybe point two is that this Gen Z girl really understands, and I think the young people understand economics a little bit. Like they understand the risks, like the money risks, meaning they understand there's a financial pressure, much more probably than what I would think of the sexual revolution,
right?
In the late 60s and the early 70s, where young people were traveling all over the world, all over the country, in literally hitchhiking. You didn't need a lot of money. People were just like, hey, come hang out with me. You had the Charlie Mansons, man, that were just like, yo, got the ranch, come and hang out. You had people living in communities,
right?
All kinds of interesting cults,
so the communes, yeah.
Communes. Yeah, and it was just an interesting vibe where you didn't need a lot of money, and your sex, things didn't. There wasn't an incredible cost to a lot of things
right
back then. Where today, you go to ER, and every Gen Z knows this because they have parents, and the parents are always stressed about money. And like, man, that ER trip was $26,000. How for 8 hours,
right?
Woo, glad we got some insurance, or woo, whatever. We got to, they know economic pressure,
right?
And so I think the young people today too, above all things, they fear that risk. There's a fear of risk. It's not so much the guy and the phallic that's the problem,
right?
With the young girl, right? But it's the risk. It's the financial risk. There's an emotional risk too.
And you and I were actually just talking about this yesterday, where I think a lot of people in this new generation have also been told kind of this lie where you shouldn't have to sacrifice, right? You should be able to have everything you want, so it's like you shouldn't have to choose between having like an amazing career and a great marriage and a family or anything like that. You should just be able to have it all, and if anything happens in your life that prevents you from having it all, that is an imposition on your happiness, and you should be able to do something about it. So like, if you get married to somebody and you realize, like, let's say someone gets married to a guy and he's in the military and he ends up having to go to a different state and they're going to have to pull up stakes and move with him, they'd be like, no, that's not right. I'm going to stay here. And this happened to a lot of my buddies in the military, right? They would move over to a different place and their wives are like, well, I'm not going to move with you. Like I got stuff going on right here. I shouldn't have to give up my life to be around you.
That's so common today.
That's right. Or like, I'm not going to give up my friend group in order to be exclusive with my husband or my wife. I'm not going to give up my college dreams. I'm not going to put a pause on them in order to have a kid, if I get pregnant or something like that. I shouldn't have to compromise any of my dreams for anything else. I shouldn't have to sacrifice. That's the idea. And I was just talking to this couple not too long ago where they were talking about their issues with sacrifice and having kids. And I was like, well, as Christians, we do believe that the greatest happiness only comes through sacrifice. So what we learn from the life of Jesus is that his joy was through the cross, right? So through his sacrifice in us, that's why it says in Hebrews 12, for the joy set out before him, he endured the cross, despising the shame. He found that his greatest fulfillment and joy was only going to happen through a sacrifice of something that he wanted for something that he needed. And as Christians, that should be our perspective, that, yeah, there is a sacrifice that comes with not being as sexually promiscuous as I want to be. There is a sacrifice that comes of potentially having a kid and having to take on that as a responsibility.
And it's interesting how the young generation reminds me so much of a story or a narrative I was just reading in Joshua, but it's one that it's kind of throughout the book of Numbers, and it's reiterated in Deuteronomy, and then it flows into Joshua. But it's this idea of Gad, Manasseh, half tribe of Manasseh, and Reuben wanting to stay on the east of the Jordan.
Right.
And it's kind of interesting, their idea, because it's kind of like what you're describing with the younger generation, like that lack of sacrifice. It's really the lack of seeing the collective and the value of the collective.
Right.
And the sacrifice that needs to be made for the collective to thrive and to flourish and to have a future and a hope. And because the young culture doesn't look too much to the future, they tend to see themselves just kind of in the here and now, kind of like, Gad and Reuben and Manasseh, where they're just like, like going over the Jordan, like I'm facing all those people, like, we'll do it if you want us to.
We'll send some guys. We'll send our JV squad, but man, we're not going.
He's like, but we've collected a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
He's like, man, we got our buddies, we got our friends, we got our ox, we got our cattle.
Right.
He's like, man, we got a lot of stuff, and this land's pretty awesome. And that's the way you're describing the Gen Z person.
Absolutely. I think it was Arthur Pinker, but he was describing kind of this culture of instant gratification.
Yeah.
And he said, they do not know what can make them happy, for the present hour consumes their imagination.
Yeah, it's all right there.
So it's like, why would I give up what I have for a potential benefit in the future?
Yeah, and instead of, those tribes looking at, hey, the other, 9.5 tribes and saying, hey, well, it's important to help them out.
Right.
And this is going to be all of us, all of our future is going to be about getting over the Jordan and taking the land, taking the territory. And yeah, you find a parallel there with that Gen Z group, right? Where they just get stuck with their friends. They, it's hard for them to detach from their social medias. They find that more valuable than getting with a person for life and being with them. It's hard for them to just say, hey, no, I'm gonna be with you, that kind of idea. But it's interesting how when Roe vs Wade comes down, sexually speaking, that lady, that young girl is just very clear of like, hey, I'll go like bisexual, and it's so it doesn't seem like it's a issue for her or nothing. It just seems kind of flowy, man. It just goes.
Yeah, it's just like I can
That's the
just
way it's
choose
gonna
it,
be,
you know?
man. Yeah.
This is another quote from a different girl. She says, Gen Z is one of the most open about sex and hookup culture, Adeline said. She told Insider that among her friends, most women are entirely supportive of other women's sexual decisions. Whether they're sexually active or celibate, overwhelming sex positivity, however, doesn't necessarily translate to overwhelming amounts of sex. Now, this is interesting. The generation is actually having less casual sex than their predecessors, according to the 2021 study. Experts linked the deficit in decreased alcohol consumption, excessive social media use, and increasingly delayed markers of adulthood. But even if they're not copiously partaking in sexual activity, members of Gen Z Insider spoke to said that they don't approach sex as the taboo it once was. We're a lot more comfortable talking about it, Adeline said. So me and you were just talking about this at lunch, how this generation through like social media and stuff, it's like their sex drive and their sex imagination and fantasy life is like dialed up to an untold level. But it just, because they're so socially disconnected from physical people, that it doesn't tend to translate to
Into sex.
actually having sex, but they're talking about it all the time.
Right. In their brains, man, they are all
It's
Ron
always
Jeremys.
going that way. Yeah.
They're all studs. Well,
Everything is sex.
Well, and this might be, you know, the one of the results of the great porn experiment.
Right.
Of free porn, sexualizing children, you know, just going nuts.
Right.
You know, just all the porn you want to consume is all there for you.
Right.
Whatever kind, anything you could think of.
Yeah.
Anything goes, you know, is all yours.
Which, if the goal is safety and security, then that is far more safe and secure than even homosexuality.
Right.
So it's like if my worry is about getting pregnant or having kids or, you know, maybe even contracting some sort of a disease, the safest way for me to practice my sexuality is solo.
Yeah, and it's kind of interesting that the young culture doesn't, not everybody, you know, our sex lives don't just go like in a pact.
Right.
Like you think people would just go like, hey, Roe vs Wade, there's a risk in having sex with a guy. You know, that's fine. I've been masturbating since I was 4 years old.
Right. Right.
Right? I mean, something like that, you know.
Which, that sounds weird to you guys. Beau was actually quoting something I told him. So I was listening to a debate between a lady named Brenda, and she was debating a pro-life woman, very smart woman named Lila Rose. And she legitimately said that if you want less abortions, you need to start sex education really young. And Lila Rose pressed her and said, well, how young are you talking? And she said, well, I started masturbating when I was 3. And she was like, no, like you mean you were just like touching yourself down there with 3? She's like, no, I masturbated and had orgasms when I was 3. So that so if that sounds weird, you'd be like, no way. Like that is how people are thinking nowadays.
Yeah. So my thought is like, okay, so you have all this free porn. You know, it's not the Southern California, it's not the New York lifestyle, it's not the, you know, red light district lifestyle. You have now, for the last 20 years, you have, or more, you have all the porn anybody could ever want.
Right.
Just in Wisconsin,
Yeah.
you know, wherever you are, you know, it doesn't matter. And so you have a ton of kids that are viewing an enormous amount of sexual content. And if it's not pornography, because I don't want you to think porn's the big culprit here.
Right.
There's many sexualized images, podcast.
Or you could even just like have sexual relations with people online.
Yeah, just talking about sex.
Sending pictures,
That's right.
sending videos.
Yeah, listening to podcasters and they're talking about their sex.
Right.
You know, again, sexualizing the 11-year-old who likes a podcaster.
Right.
Who's listening to someone on YouTube, a YouTuber. But the YouTuber talks about, you know, their homosexual lifestyle, or they talk about their heterosexual lifestyle, or whatever they're into.
Right.
You know, and they sexualize, you know, that 11-year-old's just getting fed this all the time in that community.
Right.
You know, and so there's all that going on.
And you also need to think, for those of us who, growing up in a more materialistic world, you have to understand that Gen Z is a much more spiritual generation than I think any prior to it. And what I mean by that is, like, when I'm talking about spirit, I'm talking about like the mind, the consciousness, where for most of us, living in, growing up in the 90s, and you growing up before me in the 70s, 80s, if you want to experience things, you have to take your body there and experience it. But this generation, their majority of their experiences are online. So they don't actually have to engage their bodies in anything to make themselves feel like they're engaging with it. So voyeurism and vicarious living are kind of the norm as opposed to the actual behavior in their life.
Yeah, voyeurism's definitely beyond normal. It is just their world.
Right.
And I think it is for humans in general.
Right.
In most ways, I've argued that before. But
Well, I think that, like, voyeurism obviously has always tantalized us, but we usually tend to like to be voyeuristic towards, people used to think it was only towards glamour. That's why we liked celebrity culture.
yeah.
But then reality TV came out, and we realized, oh, we'll watch anybody.
Yeah.
Like, we'll watch, like,
Yeah.
literally anybody with a pulse
Yeah.
doing anything. We will watch
Right.
if it's on TV.
Right.
So it is
We
very,
watch
like,
people cooking.
Yeah, you can watch people cooking. You can watch Storage Wars. You can watch,
People
like,
barbecuing in the
people
backyard.
barbecuing. Like, if you flipped on your TV today and you accidentally realized that your neighbor's webcam was on and they were brushing their teeth, you'd probably watch it for a couple minutes. Like, there's just something weird about us where we love watching people.
Yeah.
But I think the difference with this generation is that the voyeurism actually satisfies their wants and desires to live an actual life of their own, right? So just watching someone else live their life feels satisfactory to somebody, where it's like, if I'm voyeuristic, if I watch someone live their life, I'm still kind of like, actually, oftentimes, if I'm, like, voyeuristically watching something, if I went and binged, a documentary about something, I'd probably be like, I need to go out and do something. Like, I need to go, like, I'm not going to stop watching these people's lives, but I want to go do something. I feel lazy. I feel like I'm not doing anything. I think someone in Gen Z, that is their something. They're like, oh, I'm going to go do something. I'm going to go watch this person do this. I'm going to listen to this podcast. I'm going to read this article. I'm going to check out this person's webcam. I'm going to message this person. I'm going to, that is them living their lives.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's hard for us to understand.
Yeah, totally. It's definitely there's definitely a generation gap there.
And they are, like, the majority of them are making their livings online too.
Yeah.
So it's like their whole world is online.
Yeah, and so it's interesting to me that with all that being said, it's interesting that why can't this person who you just quoted, why can't they just go like, hey, like, I'm just going to watch a ton of porn and I'm going to be good to go.
Yeah.
Like, what, but they still feel like they need connection, which I find fascinating in a way. Why, you would think that, porn would just, like, kind of take over the globe, where people would just be like, hey, I'm good, and there is people that are like that just go, hey, I'd just do porn and I will go solo, but it doesn't seem like that's how the full tribe goes. People definitely have their different, ways of fulfilling their sexual desires, wishes, and wants. And but I mean, you could see that Gen Z definitely is more open to talk about all kinds of different sexuality, sexual positions, things like that. But that's because probably of the porn influence in their world. They are around a lot of sexual things a lot earlier.
Right.
So to them, it is very normalized.
But when you listen to these people, and again, some of these people, they're younger, they're like teenagers, but the majority of people quoted in this article are in their 20s.
Oh, okay.
And when you listen to them talk, you have to, like, you would think that they're teenagers.
Yeah.
And you realize that these are people that are just
That's what
big
I think.
kids. Yeah, they
just-
really are.
Me just hearing them, I'm like, oh, they live at 14.
Yeah, that's what it sounds like. Is because they're just so young, like they're so infantilized by this culture that doesn't let them grow up. Now, listen to this quote and just listen how naive this sounds. And you realize, like, here's this person that's talking about sex all the time. They're thinking about sex, but they have the sexual maturity of a 12-year-old. They really do in their thought process. So listen to this. This is Catherine D. On the other hand, has already participated in hookup culture before the Supreme Court decision dropped. Being on birth control is not an option due to the way it negatively affects her physical and mental health. Catherine said, so she's been left to reevaluate the consequences of casual sex that have suddenly become very real. As much as I want to have fun in my 20s, what happens to me when the fun stops? What happens to me when I might be in need of an abortion and can't access that? She said, the unknowns have left her feeling like a more reserved version of herself as she contemplates the risks now tied to her body. It's like you never thought about risks tied to your body when it came to promiscuous sex.
Which is bizarre. And another thing is, not only did she never think of it, but it's interesting that the idea of reshifting her thought life or her sexual life is somehow seen as a negative.
Right.
Like she's not herself.
How terrible.
How terrible. She's not herself.
She's not hooking up with strangers.
Yeah.
Like, what a terrible thing we've done to this young girl.
Yeah, it's like it's in my mind. I'm like, well, why is it that when we have to think about something that has that, it's like, why is that the negative?
Right.
Like, why is it that we have? It's like we're so into affirming.
Right.
Our own pleasure.
Yeah.
That we really are blinded.
Right.
To any like harm that we could be doing. She doesn't mention anything like that. Like, maybe the abortion thing's not good. Like, yeah, it is. There is a life that's being taken there, and maybe like what I'm doing to my body's not good either.
Right.
And maybe emotionally, the reason I'm the way I am and feeling not like me, maybe I'm in like a cognitive dissonance.
Right.
Maybe I'm going against what I know to be wrong.
Right.
And I keep doing it, and I'm in this vicious cycle.
Right.
But it's the only thing that makes me feel good. It's
Right.
very like, do drugs, right? It's the only thing that makes you feel good,
Right.
It's like, and we would say to that drug addict, like, man, good. You're doing your drugs.
Yeah.
You're feeling better.
Yeah.
Great.
That's right. If you ever been around someone when they're trying to sober up, like it would be really easy to say to that person, you're so unhappy.
Yeah.
You seem so unhappy right now. You just like miserable.
Maybe you need to go to the bar.
Maybe you need to go back to the drugs, man, because you just seem so sad all the time.
That's right.
Like, that's kind of what's going on. Just because your body's having an adverse reaction to something doesn't actually mean you're doing something bad to your body.
Right.
Maybe your body's detoxing from something worse, and so.
Right.
But these kids, and they are kids, like their mentality is that of kids.
Yeah.
Their decision is that of kids. It never really equates to them that they're thinking about it in a really immature way.
Yeah. A very animalistic, just self-absorbed way.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's like the fact that, again, when it comes to sexual maturity, it's like one of the first things you're supposed to learn in sexual maturity when you're young and you're like in your teenage years, sex really is all about recreation and fun. So when I was like 13 and I first started thinking about sex, I wasn't thinking about marriage. I wasn't thinking about having a family or anything like that. I was just thinking about having fun.
Yeah.
Like your hormones are just starting to turn up, and you're like, wow, like there are a lot of things that feel good.
Yeah, you're just waking up and you're
Yeah.
like, yo,
Yeah.
what's going on?
And you're starting to notice people in your class, and you're
Yeah.
like, they look good now. I don't know what happened.
Something's going down, man. I got a
Something's
little
very
hair on the armpit. Like,
So
yeah.
you're very immature, but it's supposed to be as you grow up, you're supposed to be understanding more and more of the consequences of sex.
Yeah.
You're supposed to be thinking more about the emotional relationships and emotional intimacy and relational intimacy.
Yeah, health.
And again, this is all stuff that people who aren't Christians think about. You know, like even when I was talking to my friends and the Marines who are not Christians and are were very sexually promiscuous, their minds were going in that direction where they're like, yeah, you know, I'm in my 20s, this is fun, but eventually maybe I do want to settle down, and eventually maybe I do want to have a family, and is this good for me?
And it's funny how
Yeah.
people throw out LGBTQ all the time, like LGBT, that's always something that's thrown out. But you just take anything, you go, okay, let's take lesbianism.
Right.
Okay, so you go up to a young person in Gen Z and say, okay, is lesbianism cool? Absolutely, it's fine, it's great. You know, it's because they're gonna affirm everything.
Right.
Right. Okay, so if I'm a lesbian, can I have sex with a different lesbian partner every night? And they start going, like I don't know, like I guess you could,
Right.
but is that really healthy?
Right.
And it's funny how like you can take that with anything. Like you can take it with bisexuality. Like you bi, and they go, oh yeah, I'm bi, and you go, oh okay, and they'll affirm it. Like cool, that's cool. But if you said like, hey, I have a different sexual partner each night of the different sex.
Right.
Do you think that's good? Generation Z would be like, I don't know if that's good. It's interesting. It's like we affirm the idea.
Right.
We affirm the idea of sexual freedom.
Right.
But when it comes down to it, we really don't like, the promiscuous sexual person.
Right.
It doesn't matter, you choose any of them.
Right.
But we don't like the person who just says, oh yeah. It's just like with heterosexuality. Someone says, hey, I'm heterosexual, but I have sex with a different partner. Different partner
every night. Yeah.
You'd be like, oh, I'm not for that.
Yeah.
So
I remember we had it was like a year or two ago, we did a podcast with Nathan, our friend Nathan, who lives out in California. And, he's in that lifestyle, the LGBTQ lifestyle. And he was talking about how he was feeling more freed up and he was feeling more able to be himself because of the affirmation he was getting. And we were asking him questions about some of his friends and the lifestyles they were leading. And he was like, yeah, I'm totally against polyamory. The idea that you could just be in the gay lifestyle and just sleep around. He's like, I feel like the Bible's really calling that kind of behavior out in 1 Corinthians 6. It's not calling out gayness per se. It's calling out that kind of polyamory relationship.
That was his argument.
That was his argument. And I was like, okay, well, so if you think that's wrong, have you ever told your friends that? You ever told them like, hey, what you're doing is wrong? And he's like, well, no, I don't think it's really my place to say that it's wrong. And I was like, but is it wrong? And he's like, and he's like, well, it's kind of like wrong. I think it's bad, but it's like, okay, so should you tell him that? And he's like, well, I wouldn't tell him that, and he kind of goes in like this circle.
And it's just, I find it so like there's not a really good cohesive flow of logic that goes throughout it, throughout this way of thinking.
Right.
Because this person in the article is saying, hey, I'm totally, not concerned about my having sex with whomever I want.
Right. And then, being able to abort my child and live, none of that really enters into her head as being something weird.
Yeah, but if you go up to her, and I'm sure if you go up to her and you say, hey, do you think it's good to have a sexual partner each night?
Right.
Like for a year.
Right.
Like, what would you think about that?
Yeah.
I'm sure she'd go like, that's pretty risky.
Yeah.
That's high risk. I don't think that's a good thing to do.
Good thing. And this is the men. So they did interview some men. And again, how many people would be okay with this answer? So this is a lot of the men in Generation Z. The few men who did respond were more likely to say that the possibility of Roe being overturned did not influence or change their attitudes towards sex. So again, they're not interviewing guys who are like, oh yeah, it's not going to change my mind because I'm planning on getting married and I wasn't going to. These are dudes who are still going to sleep around, but they're like, I don't care if I might knock up a girl that I sleep with because it's not my body, like I'm not going to have to deal with the consequences of that. That's on her. And I was just talking to someone about this where in the 1700s, there was a move towards what we would call feminism and sexual liberty. And the reason why it stopped is because all the dudes were sleeping around,
Mhm.
but the girls were getting pregnant, and the girls are trying to hang with the dudes. They were trying to hang with the guys who are the rock stars, just having sex with tons of chicks. But then they realized, I can't keep hanging with this guy because once I get knocked up, he leaves me because it's more convenient.
Yeah, and this is I think super phenomenal of a quote, and because it shows that men win,
Yep.
and it shows that that abortion is really a anti-feminist movement.
Yeah.
And I know that's hard for people to understand.
Yeah.
So let me just unpack that.
Yeah.
But the ability for a woman to have abortions on demand is anti-feminist because it doesn't promote the value of the womb.
Right.
It diminishes the value of the womb
Right.
that a woman holds. And what it promotes is man's ability to do whatever he wants with his sexuality whenever he wants with very little consequence.
Right.
And it puts a woman into that caricature.
Right.
So that's what I'm saying. It has killed feminism.
Right.
It is basically making a woman a woman is basically yelling from the rooftop when she's having an abortion, I want to be like a man.
Right.
And so men win. It's a win-win. And this Generation Z guy knows it.
Yeah.
And no one had to give him some philosophy lesson on it.
Yeah.
He just knows it innately.
Right.
He just knows, like,
This allows me to do what I want.
this allows me to do what I want. And you know what? And it's like, I'm still going to do what I want.
Right.
Because this world, this culture is not about making men step up to the plate.
Right.
It's about diminishing women.
Right. And if you talk, by the way,
That's
if
a
you talk to women who have had abortions, not all of them,
Mhm.
but there is a large percentage of women who will tell you, I was with a dude, I got pregnant, I told him, and he said, you need to get an abortion. Right? There are so many stories where even
Endless.
pro-choice women who have always supported the idea of choice, but what happens is they get pregnant, they're on the fence, they're like, I don't know, maybe we should keep it, maybe not, and the dude's like, if you don't abort that child, like, I'm out. I'm not going to help you take care of it. I'm not a part of this. That is your decision, but you need to abort your child. And that is something that, again, doesn't really get talked about in the pro-choice movement very much, is that it does tend to be a lot of men telling women what to do with their bodies.
Right. And isn't that sad? All these women going to an abortion clinic, so many of them pressured by who? A man.
Right.
And they go alone. The men aren't there.
Right.
And so when you have a culture that is not for making men responsible
Right.
for their actions, there is no responsibility for men in their actions. And this guy knows it.
Right.
In his 20s.
Right.
He knows that the culture does nothing.
Right.
to
And by the way,
hold
it
men.
wasn't just one guy. That was the vast majority. That was the answer of the vast majority of men. So the quote that I just read was not just from one singular respondent. It was from the vast majority of men that they interviewed said that.
See, I mean,
So-
and that just shows that women unfortunately think they're doing something that's pro women and pro feminist, but it's actually diminishing women and it's anti-feminist.
Right.
You actually are playing right into the hands of a non-responsible gender.
Right.
Males do not have to be responsible, and you see that.
Exactly. And you don't see it turn around either. So it's like you can't expect for a man who's trained himself so much to not take responsibility for his actions to all of a sudden become a responsible man when he gets married to you. So finally when you lock him down and he gets in there and you have kids, how many people listen to this podcast, going to church, how many people had fathers who were present and actually helped raise you when you were kids? And how many people have fathers? Most people have fathers that they don't know, or fathers that abandon them, or fathers that divorced their mom, or if they had a father that was in the house, a father that was just not present.
Yeah, Denzel's right.
Yeah.
Denzel Washington.
Denzel is always right.
That's right.
No, as we said, because he's from the black community, and
Yeah.
I think the stats right now are like 75% fatherlessness in the black communities, and it's no mistake that there's 75% fatherlessness in black communities, and black communities have more abortions than any other group, right? So in New York City, it is legitimately safer the most dangerous place for a black child in New York City is in the womb, because more black children are aborted than born in New York City. That's insane. But Denzel Washington talks about that. He says if young men don't find their fathers in the home, they find them on the streets. So when he was talking about why there's this epidemic of violence, gang violence in black communities, that's the reason. He said there's no fathers, there's no male responsibility there.
Yeah, and that's what you see in the abortion issue as well.
Right.
Right. And it's sad that these young guys, see it and they already know it, and they already know that they win. They already know that when women are out picketing and doing their thing for an abortion, that they might think it's their freedom, but it's not. It's
Right.
their bondage.
Right.
They are right back to wanting to be like men. They'll never be a man, but they want to be like a man.
Right.
They'll do anything to be like a man.
Right.
Yet the men are absent that got them pregnant. They're not around. They're nowhere to be found. There's no repercussions in their life, anything like that. So.
And listen to this quote, because it's, again, very telling in how deceived this generation is. It says, again, one of these young girls, she says, the decision became less surprising as she considered the Supreme Court's gender, race, and age makeup. They're not personally affected by it, she said. So in her mind, the reason why this happened is because there's a bunch of men, forcing women to do these things, men who don't care. What she fails to acknowledge is that Roe versus Wade was passed by 9 white guys. Roe versus Wade was overturned by the most diverse Supreme Court this country has ever had. Right? You had women on it. You had 2 women on it. You had a black guy on it. You had a couple white guys. Right? So you have this really diverse Supreme Court that overturns Roe versus Wade. But 9 white guys passing Roe versus Wade, no, they're feminists. And it's like how deceived this girl is to believe that, once again, if it was a Supreme Court made up of all women, then Roe versus Wade would have gone through. Well, maybe not. Maybe it's not a mistake that 9 white guys passed Roe versus Wade in the first place.
Right. And that's the sad irony of it all.
Right.
Right. Is maybe the villain's right there before your face.
Right.
And you just can't see it.
And even real quick, because I know we're over time, but a lot of people are championing these corporations like Amazon and Chase, again, all run by rich white guys, because they're saying, hey, if you work for our company and you need an abortion, we'll fly you out for free to get an abortion. And women are like, oh man, these guys care so much about me. No, they don't want to pay for your maternity leave. Yeah. That's why. The guy wins again, right? The man wins again. He gets the maximum amount of work from his female workers and doesn't have to fulfill his responsibility as an employer to provide you with maternity leave and benefits for having a child. That's what's going on. So again, it's always just these, you think you're rebelling against the rich white guys, right? The rich white guys are the ones that want this, right?
That's right.
They are the ones that are pushing for it harder than anybody.
Such an irony, so crazy, right? And it's amazing how, propaganda works. And I think the young generation, and people mean well, they try to do the right thing, but the Bible is so true.
Yeah.
That there's a way that seems right.
Yeah.
But in the end, it leads to destruction.
Yeah.
It seems right.
Right.
And so Jesus says, hey, they do not know what they do. And in a sense, there's we are just like lost sheep, man, wandering around, just really blind leading the blind. It's really sad to watch,
right.
And that's what I think people are frustrated with, and today with Gen Z, is that they seem very willing to follow the leaders, follow the rulers, on these paths of destruction. And they eat up propaganda like it's like the gospel.
Yeah.
They're just like, yes, which I wish there was much more skepticism, in Generation Z, to really think about, people in power and what is being told to them, and them questioning it. Because you're right, the rebellious movement today is going to be, the pure movement.
Right.
It's going to be the purity movement. That'll be the rebellious movement,
which is radical.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. But it's not so different from 2,000 years ago.
Yeah.
Right. With
the Christians were the counterculture.
That was the counterculture, and that was the radical atheist.
Right.
That they were called atheists back then, because they didn't worship the Roman gods and stuff like that. So, hey, great podcast. We'll catch you guys next time. Okay, take care. Bye-bye.
Check out runninglight.org to begin our 2 video series, Take Flight and Love or Lust. You can also send us questions on Twitter at Running Light or on our runninglight.org podcast page. Like us on Facebook at Running Light Ministries. Psalm 36:8. They are abundantly satisfied with the fullness of your house, and you give them drink from the river of your pleasures.